When General George Patton uttered just 2 words into a telephone on December 19, 1944, his fellow commanders thought he had either gone mad or was making promises he couldn't possibly keep. The Germans, confident in their massive surprise offensive, were certain no force on earth could stop their advance. They were about to discover how catastrophically wrong they were. What unfolded over the next 40 days in the frozen forests of Belgium and Luxembourg would become one of the most extraordinary military achievements in American history, a story of impossible logistics, unbreakable will, and one man's absolute refusal to accept defeat. The storm breaks, the morning of December 16, 1944, shattered the winter silence of the Ardennes forest. Nearly 300,000 German soldiers, supported by 1,000 tanks, crashed through thinly defended American lines in what would become Hitler's final desperate gamble to turn the tide of the war. The offensive, code-named Watch on the Rhine, achieved something Allied commanders thought impossible: complete tactical surprise. The Ardennes had been considered a quiet sector, a place where green American divisions could gain experience and exhausted veteran units could rest and recover. The forest itself was dense and difficult terrain, crossed by narrow roads and steep valleys. Allied intelligence officers had convinced themselves that the Germans would never attempt a major offensive through such challenging ground, especially not in winter. They were catastrophically wrong. For weeks, the Wehrmacht had moved this massive force into position, using only darkness for cover and maintaining absolute radio silence. German commanders had learned from their earlier mistakes. Every movement occurred at night. Troops marched in felt boots to muffle sound. Vehicles had their exhausts muffled. Fighter aircraft flew constant patrols to prevent Allied reconnaissance. The deception was so complete that Allied intelligence had detected nothing unusual. When dawn broke that December morning, German armored columns were already racing westward, leaving chaos and destruction in their wake. American positions were overwhelmed within minutes. Communication lines were cut. Command posts were overrun before officers could even comprehend what was happening. Young American soldiers, many experiencing combat for the first time, found themselves facing veteran SS Panzer divisions. The opening barrage was unlike anything the Americans in that sector had ever experienced. Thousands of German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously at 5:30 a.m., turning the pre-dawn darkness into a hellish landscape of fire and explosions. The bombardment lasted for 90 minutes, pulverizing American positions. Then came the infantry, waves of German soldiers emerging from the morning mist, like ghosts. Behind the infantry came the armor, Tiger II tanks weighing 70 tons each, Panther tanks with their deadly 75mm guns, and supporting armored vehicles. The narrow forest roads that Allied planners thought would prevent tank operations suddenly filled with German steel. The German plan was breathtakingly ambitious: punch through 60 miles of Allied territory, capture the vital port city of Antwerp, and split British and American forces in half. If successful, Hitler believed he could force the Western Allies to negotiate peace, allowing Germany to focus all its strength against the Soviet Union advancing from the east. German commanders had been given specific objectives with strict timetables. They needed to reach the Meuse River within 48 hours. Antwerp had to fall within a week. Hitler himself had planned the offensive in obsessive detail, overruling objections from his generals. He was convinced that one decisive blow could change the course of the war, just as his 1940 offensive through the same Ardennes forest had resulted in the stunning defeat of France. Within the first 72 hours, the situation looked catastrophic for the Americans. German spearheads had penetrated 20 miles into Belgium. Entire American units were surrounded, scattered, or obliterated. The 106th Infantry Division, which had only arrived in theater weeks earlier, was effectively destroyed. 2 entire regiments surrendered, representing the worst American defeat in the European theater. Critical road junctions fell to German control. The crucial crossroads town of Bastogne was under siege, surrounded by German forces. The bulge in Allied lines grew deeper by the hour. Panic spread through Allied headquarters. Some officers openly discussed the possibility of a general retreat, possibly all the way back to France. German soldiers, many of whom had been fighting defensive battles for months, suddenly found their spirits revitalized. They were advancing again, capturing American equipment and supplies. Some German units even dressed in captured American uniforms and drove American vehicles to create confusion behind Allied lines. English-speaking German commandos cut telephone wires, changed road signs, and spread false orders. The weather favored the Germans perfectly. Heavy cloud cover prevented Allied air forces from flying. The mighty American Air Armada, which had dominated European skies for months, sat grounded on muddy airfields. German commanders knew their window of opportunity was limited. Once the weather cleared, Allied air superiority would reassert itself. But for now, the skies belonged to no one, and that gave the Wehrmacht its best chance. The man who saw opportunity in disaster, while other Allied generals scrambled to understand what was happening. 59-year-old George S. Patton Jr. saw something different. Where others saw catastrophe, he recognized the opportunity of a lifetime. Patton had spent his entire career preparing for exactly this kind of moment. Born into a military family in 1885 at the family estate in California, young George grew up surrounded by tales of his ancestors' military exploits. His grandfather had been a Confederate colonel killed during the Civil War. His father filled his childhood with stories of ancient warriors and military glory. Young George was dyslexic and struggled academically, but he possessed a photographic memory for military history and an unshakable belief in his own destiny. At West Point, Patton barely passed his academics but excelled at military exercises and horsemanship. He competed in the 1912 Olympic pentathlon in Stockholm, finishing 5th overall. He studied swordsmanship in France and designed a new cavalry saber that was adopted by the U.S. Army. Every aspect of his early career pointed toward one goal: preparing himself to command armies in decisive battles. When America entered World War I, Patton volunteered for the newly formed Tank Corps. He personally supervised the training of America's first tank crews, wrote the first American manual on tank operations, and led tanks into combat at the Battle of Saint-Mihiel. Wounded by machine gun fire, he continued directing his tanks until blood loss forced him to stop. The experience taught him the revolutionary potential of armored warfare, the ability to break through enemy lines and exploit deep into the rear areas. Between the wars, Patton studied relentlessly. He read everything written about military history, from ancient Greek battles to Napoleon's campaigns. He wrote papers on tank tactics that were largely ignored by an army focused on traditional infantry warfare. He cultivated relationships with innovators like Dwight Eisenhower, with whom he shared ideas about mechanized warfare. He learned to fly aircraft to better understand air-ground coordination. He spent summers attending cavalry exercises, winters studying at war colleges. By World War II, Patton had become the American Army's foremost expert on mobile warfare. His campaigns in North Africa and Sicily demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of aggressive armored operations. His tanks moved faster and struck harder than anyone expected. He personally flew over battlefields in a Piper Cub to observe terrain and enemy positions. He visited frontline units constantly, encouraging soldiers and firing incompetent officers on the spot. But Patton's path to this moment had been rocky. His volatile temper and the infamous slapping incidents, where he physically struck two soldiers suffering from battle fatigue, calling them cowards, had nearly destroyed his career. General Eisenhower seriously considered sending him home in disgrace. Only Patton's proven abilities as a combat commander saved him. Even so, he was sidelined during the initial D-Day invasion, used instead as a decoy to convince Germans the main invasion would come at Calais. When Patton's Third Army finally entered combat in late July 1944, he made up for lost time. His armored columns raced across France at speeds that astounded both allies and enemies. In one 30-day period, the Third Army advanced 400 miles, liberated 50,000 square miles of French territory, and captured 100,000 German prisoners. German commanders admitted they had never faced such aggressive, relentless pursuit. But the fall of 1944 had brought frustration. Supply shortages, particularly gasoline, forced Patton's advance to slow dramatically. The priority for supplies went to British Field Marshal Montgomery's Operation Market Garden in Holland, a decision that infuriated Patton. Then came the brutal fighting around Metz, where German defenders turned ancient forts into killing zones. Patton's casualties mounted, while progress measured in yards rather than miles. Many questioned whether his aggressive style would work against a determined enemy defending their homeland. Some military analysts suggested Patton was brilliant at pursuit, but less effective in set-piece battles. Staff officers in comfortable headquarters whispered that perhaps Patton's style of warfare belonged to an earlier era, unsuited for the grinding combat of late 1944. Patton heard these whispers, and they burned. He wrote to his wife, Beatrice, that he felt destiny had something greater in store for him, that God was saving him for some crucial moment. He told his staff that the war would provide one more great opportunity for decisive action, and when it came, the Third Army needed to be ready. Now, with the German offensive creating chaos throughout Allied command structures, that moment had arrived. While other generals saw their careful plans collapsing into confusion, Patton saw the chance he had been preparing for his entire life. The opportunity to demonstrate that audacious leadership and aggressive action could overcome any obstacle. The meeting that made history. On December 19th, Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower called an emergency conference at Verdun, the ancient French fortress city, scene of horrific World War I battles, now hosted a gathering that would determine the fate of the Allied campaign in Europe. The atmosphere was grim when commanders arrived. Officers brought reports of disaster from every sector. The First Army was in disarray, its commander, General Courtney Hodges, nearly in shock from the speed and violence of the German assault. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery was already suggesting a strategic withdrawal to more defensible positions. Some staff officers were burning documents, preparing for possible evacuation. The conference room was cold, heated only by a single pot-bellied stove. Maps covering the walls showed the terrible truth. A massive German salient bulging 50 miles into Allied lines. Red arrows indicated German advances. Blue symbols marking American units were crossed out or marked as location unknown. The visual representation of the catastrophe was sobering. Eisenhower opened the meeting with characteristic directness. The present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us and not of disaster, he announced, though the strain showed on his face. There will be only cheerful faces at this conference table. Patton, who had driven through terrible weather to attend, couldn't resist. "Hell, let's have the guts to let the bastards go all the way to Paris," he said with a grin. "Then we'll really cut 'em off and chew 'em up." The comment broke some of the tension, drawing nervous laughter from around the table. But Eisenhower needed more than bravado. He needed solutions, not jokes. The Germans were still advancing. Bastogne would fall within days, unless reinforced. The entire Allied offensive into Germany was in jeopardy. If the Germans actually reached Antwerp and cut Allied supply lines, the consequences would be catastrophic. General Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group, outlined the desperate situation. Communications were in chaos. Nobody knew exactly where German spearheads were. Entire American regiments had simply vanished. The weather prevented air reconnaissance and grounded the mighty Allied air forces. It was in this context that Eisenhower turned to Patton and asked the crucial question. "George, How soon can you disengage your current operations, turn north, and counterattack the German flank? The room fell silent. Every officer present understood the magnitude of what was being asked. Patton's Third Army was currently engaged in heavy combat around Metz and Saarbrücken. His 6 divisions were spread across a 100-mile front, actively fighting German defenders. To disengage, rotate 90 degrees, march over 100 miles through winter storms, and arrive ready for immediate combat was a task that violated every principle of military logistics. Patton glanced at the maps, did some quick mental calculations, and gave his answer. On December 22nd, 3 days from now, I can attack with 3 full divisions. The silence became even more profound. Several officers exchanged glances, clearly thinking Patton was either lying or had lost his mind. British General Frederick Morgan openly scoffed. Even Eisenhower, who knew Patton's capabilities better than anyone, looked skeptical. "Don't be fatuous, George," Eisenhower said, using one of his favorite words for impractical ideas. But Patton wasn't bluffing, and he wasn't being fatuous. He pulled a small notebook from his jacket and read off specific details. The 4th Armored Division would lead the attack, followed by the 26th Infantry Division and the 80th Infantry Division. His staff had already calculated fuel requirements, ammunition loads, and march routes. He had contingency orders prepared for 3 different scenarios. "I've already alerted my staff," Patton explained. "We've been watching the German buildup in the Ardennes. I had my intelligence officers prepare contingency plans for exactly this situation." Eisenhower studied his old friend carefully. They had known each other for over 20 years, had studied tank warfare together in the 1920s. Eisenhower knew that Patton's outrageous confidence was usually backed by meticulous preparation. "Can you really do this, George?" Eisenhower asked quietly. "I can, Ike. My staff is waiting for my call right now. Give me the word, and the Third Army will be rolling north within hours." Around the conference table, the mood shifted. If Patton could actually deliver on this promise, it would change everything. Instead of merely trying to contain the German offensive, the Allies could counterattack while the Wehrmacht was overextended and vulnerable. Bradley raised concerns about weakening the Third Army's current sector. Wouldn't German forces opposite Patton exploit the sudden absence of American troops? Patton dismissed the concern with characteristic bluntness. "The Germans opposite me are already beaten," he said. "They're holding defensive positions. They won't attack." Montgomery, participating by telephone from his headquarters in Belgium, suggested that Patton was being optimistic and that a more cautious approach was warranted. The implication that American forces weren't capable of such a rapid maneuver irritated Patton, but he held his tongue. Eisenhower made his decision. "All right, George, I'll give you your chance, but I'm holding you to this timeline. If you say 3 days, I need you attacking in 3 days. You'll have it, Ike. We'll be attacking on the 22nd, and we'll keep attacking until we meet up with First Army, coming from the north." As the conference continued, discussing boundaries between armies and command relationships, Patton was already mentally checking off the tasks his staff would need to complete. He knew the operational orders were ready. He knew his division commanders were competent and aggressive. He knew his soldiers, though exhausted from months of combat, would respond to the challenge. What he didn't share with the others was his private belief about what was really happening. In Patton's mind, the German offensive wasn't a disaster. It was a gift. Hitler had taken his last reserves and pushed them into a vulnerable salient. Once the attack was stopped, those German divisions would be trapped and could be destroyed. The Germans had, as he would later phrase it, stuck their head in a meat grinder, and Patton had his hand on the handle. Play ball. Leaving the Verdun conference, Patton's driver navigated the icy roads back to Third Army headquarters in Luxembourg City. During the entire ride, Patton sat in the back of his Jeep, collar turned up against the bitter wind. mentally rehearsing the orders he would give. When he arrived at headquarters, he strode directly to the operations room, where his chief of staff, Major General Hobart Gay, and his operations officer, Colonel Halley Maddox, were waiting. They had been preparing for this moment since December 12th, when intelligence reports first indicated unusual German activity. Patton contacted his command post and spoke just 2 words: "Play ball." That coded phrase activated prearranged orders that set over 133,000 vehicles in motion across a 100-mile front. It was, quite simply, one of the most complex military maneuvers ever attempted. The 4th Armored Division received its orders first. Combat Command A would lead, followed by Combat Command B, with Combat Command Reserve providing security for the division's supply trains. Tank crews who had been preparing for an assault toward Saarbrücken suddenly found themselves checking maps of Belgium, plotting routes to Bastogne that most had never heard of. The 26th Infantry Division, the Yankee division that had fought with distinction in World War I, began pulling back from its positions around Metz. Infantry battalions that had been preparing to assault fortified German bunkers now prepared for a rapid march north. Artillery batteries limbered their guns, calculated new firing positions, and loaded ammunition trucks. The 80th Infantry Division, still engaged in heavy combat, faced perhaps the most difficult task. They needed to disengage from active fighting, hand their sector over to other units, and begin moving north, all without alerting German intelligence to what was happening. It was like changing horses at full gallop. Behind these 3 divisions came the logistics tail that would keep them fighting. Supply convoys hauling 62,000 tons of ammunition, fuel, food, and equipment. Quartermaster units worked through the night, breaking down supply dumps and loading trucks. Ordnance companies distributed ammunition, prioritizing armor-piercing shells for the expected tank battles. Medical units prepared ambulances and established plans for casualty evacuation routes they had never used before. The scale of this operation cannot be overstated. In 72 hours, Patton's Third Army would move more troops over a greater distance while maintaining combat readiness than any army in history. Over 133,000 vehicles, tanks, half-tracks, trucks, jeeps, artillery pieces, all had to move on roads that were narrow, icy, and crowded. The conditions they faced were absolutely brutal. Europe was experiencing its coldest winter in living memory. Temperatures plunged to 10 degrees Fahrenheit, sometimes lower. Blizzards reduced visibility to a few yards. Roads became rivers of ice, treacherous for wheeled vehicles and challenging even for tracked armor. American soldiers, equipped for autumn combat in France, now battled Arctic conditions in thin cotton uniforms and leather boots designed for temperate weather. Private First Class Robert Bowen of the 26th Infantry Division later described the march north. "We moved out in the middle of the night. Snow was coming down so thick you couldn't see the guy in front of you. The wind cut through your uniform like it wasn't even there. Guys were falling out from cold exhaustion after the first mile. We'd pick them up, get them moving again, because stopping meant freezing to death. The mechanized challenges were equally severe. Tank engines froze solid despite the best efforts of crews who started them every 30 minutes throughout the night. The standard 30-weight motor oil became thick as molasses in the extreme cold. Maintenance crews worked around the clock, using blowtorches to thaw frozen engines and transmissions. Weapons required constant attention. M1 Garand rifles, the standard American infantry weapon, functioned reliably in most conditions, but could jam if allowed to accumulate ice. Machine guns were even more sensitive. Crews learned to keep them wrapped in blankets between firing positions. Artillery pieces needed their recoil mechanisms checked constantly because the hydraulic fluid could thicken and cause malfunctions. The 4th Armored Division faced unique challenges moving their Shermans north. The division's Shermans, officially designated M4 medium tanks, were reliable and mechanically sound, but notoriously under-armored compared to German Panthers and Tigers. Crews knew they would be facing the best tanks in the German arsenal. They also knew that in the frozen terrain of the Ardennes, mobility and reliability mattered as much as armor thickness. Sergeant Lafayette Poole, commanding a Sherman in the 4th Armored, had already destroyed over a dozen German tanks in previous battles. He briefed his crew on the challenges ahead. "We're going up against Tigers and Panthers. Our 75mm gun can't penetrate their frontal armor at normal combat ranges. We need to be smart, hit them in the flanks, target their tracks, use the terrain. Speed and surprise are our advantages." But Patton knew that the greatest challenge wasn't mechanical or tactical. It was psychological. His soldiers had been fighting almost continuously since July. They were tired, many were sick, and all were looking forward to what they hoped might be a Christmas pause in combat. Now they were being asked to march through blizzards toward one of the most desperate battles of the war. Patton addressed this challenge in his own unique way. Rather than hiding in a heated headquarters, he made himself visible to his troops. He constantly traveled in an open jeep, his only concession to the icy temperatures being a heavy winter parka over his uniform. His face often froze, ice forming on his eyebrows and jaw, but he persisted in his daily inspections, ensuring that the news of his presence spread through the ranks. He visited units along the march routes, stopping to talk to soldiers, huddled around fires or taking breaks in villages. His words were simple and direct. "We're going to relieve Bastogne," he told a group of infantrymen from the 80th Division. "The Germans have bitten off more than they can chew, and we're going to make them choke on it. You men are the best soldiers in the world, and I wouldn't want to do this with anyone else." The psychological effect was tremendous. American soldiers fighting in conditions that would have challenged elite units drew strength from knowing that old blood and guts was enduring their hardship. His words of praise and encouragement rapidly circulated through the Third Army's communication network. "The old man says we're the finest soldiers in the world. Georgie says this is our finest hour." This wasn't just empty talk. Patton genuinely believed his soldiers were capable of the impossible, and his self-belief became theirs. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding a tank battalion in the 4th Armored, gathered his officers before the march began. "General Patton says we can do this in 3 days, he told them. "That means we're going to do it in 2. When we get to Bastogne, we're not stopping at the city limits. We're going through like we own the place, because by God, we will." The march north became an epic of endurance. Columns of vehicles stretched for miles, their headlights creating rivers of light through the darkness and snow. Military police stood at every crossroads, directing traffic and preventing the catastrophic traffic jams that would have paralyzed the movement. Engineers worked ahead of the columns, spreading sand and gravel on icy roads, reinforcing bridges to handle the weight of heavy armor. Maintenance crews performed miracles. When tanks broke down, and they frequently did in the extreme cold, recovery vehicles were there within minutes. If a tank couldn't be quickly repaired, it was pushed off the road and another took its place. The columns had to keep moving. Supply officers performed equally impressive feats. Fuel trucks leapfrogged forward, establishing temporary fuel points where tanks could refuel without stopping for long. Ammunition trucks followed, close behind combat units, ready to replenish vehicles the moment they entered combat. Field kitchens set up at road intersections, serving hot coffee and food to soldiers as they passed. The civilian population of Luxembourg and Belgium watched in amazement as this vast American army flowed north. After 4 years of German occupation, they had witnessed Wehrmacht columns retreating in defeat. Now they saw Americans advancing through winter storms with a determination that suggested nothing could stop them. Old men who had fought in World War I nodded knowingly. These Americans were serious soldiers. Not everything went smoothly. Traffic jams occurred despite the best planning. Units sometimes took wrong turns in the darkness and snow. Communication failures meant some commands weren't received. But the overall movement continued with a precision that astounded military observers. German intelligence detected the movement, of course. Reconnaissance flights, on the few occasions when weather permitted, spotted the vehicle columns. German signals intelligence intercepted radio traffic. But Wehrmacht commanders didn't believe what their intelligence was telling them. Such a rapid, large-scale movement was theoretically impossible. They convinced themselves that what they were seeing was reinforcements being rushed north piecemeal, not an entire army conducting a coordinated pivot. This German miscalculation would prove fatal. They expected scattered American units arriving exhausted and disorganized. Instead, they would face 3 full divisions arriving with their combat power intact, led by the most aggressive armored commander in the Allied forces. Why the Germans never saw it. Coming German commanders expected an American reaction, but nothing like what actually happened. General Erich Brandenberger, commanding the 7th Army in Patton's sector, had studied his opponent's tactics and respected his aggressive style. German intelligence files on Patton were thick with analysis of his previous campaigns. They knew he was dangerous. What they didn't know was that he was capable of the impossible. Brandenberger had fought on the Eastern Front and understood mobile warfare intimately. He recognized that Patton employed tactics similar to the German concept of Bewegungskrieg, war of movement, that emphasized speed, surprise, and exploitation. He fights more like a German panzer general than an American, Brandenberger had remarked to his staff. But even with this respect for his opponent, Brandenberger couldn't believe the speed and precision of what unfolded. The Wehrmacht's own brutal experience in Russia had taught them how winter could paralyze even the best armies. In the winter of 1941-42, German forces outside Moscow had watched their offensive capability evaporate as temperatures dropped to -40 degrees. Vehicles wouldn't start. Weapons froze. Soldiers died of exposure. The experience had been so traumatic that German military doctrine now treated winter operations as inherently limited affairs. They assumed the Americans, with their reputation for depending on comfort and overwhelming logistics, would be even more vulnerable to winter's effects. German propaganda had spent years portraying Americans as soft, more interested in hot showers and regular meals than serious combat. Wehrmacht officers, who had fought in North Africa and Italy, had noted how American forces seemed to stop fighting when supply lines stretched or conditions deteriorated. This assumption revealed a critical flaw in German strategic thinking. By late 1944, German commanders still underestimated American military capability. They saw U.S. forces as rich in equipment, but poor in fighting spirit and tactical skill. They acknowledged American air superiority and industrial might, but dismissed American soldiers as inferior to German troops. One German general had famously remarked that Americans are good at making cars but don't know how to make war. The Battle of the Bulge would shatter these illusions forever. But in mid-December, German confidence ran high. Hitler had personally assured his commanders that American forces would collapse under the weight of the offensive. He believed that the alliance between Britain and America was fragile, that a major defeat would cause political crisis in Washington and London. He was convinced that Germany could achieve a separate peace with the Western Allies, allowing all German forces to concentrate against the Soviet Union. German General Günther Blumentritt, Chief of Staff of Army Group B, later provided a remarkable assessment. We held General Patton in extremely high regard as the most aggressive panzer commander of the Allies. His operations impressed us enormously, probably because he approached warfare most similarly to our own classical military concepts. He was the most feared Allied general on the Western Front. Yet even Blumentritt didn't anticipate what Patton would accomplish in December 1944. In the German appreciation, such a rapid repositioning of forces required several conditions that didn't exist: weeks of planning, favorable weather, and superior logistics infrastructure. None of these conditions existed in late December 1944. The Wehrmacht of December 1944 was not the seemingly invincible force that had conquered Europe in 1940. 4 years of attritional warfare had bled the German military of its best soldiers, equipment, and resources. The divisions attacking in the Ardennes were a mixture of elite formations, like the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, and hastily assembled units filled with teenage boys drafted straight from school and middle-aged men pulled from reserve status. Oberleutnant Friedrich von der Heydte, commanding a parachute regiment, dropped behind American lines. Later described the quality of troops in the offensive. Many of my men had never jumped from an aircraft before. Some were so young they cried when we loaded into the planes. Others were veterans of Russia, worn down by years of combat, going through the motions because orders were orders. German logistics were in shambles. The Wehrmacht was desperately short of fuel, so short that Hitler's entire operational plan depended on capturing American fuel dumps. German vehicles ran on synthetic fuel produced from coal, which performed poorly in extreme cold and provided less power than petroleum-based fuel. Many German trucks and tanks ran on wood gas generators, which were even less reliable. German soldiers had not eaten properly in days. Supply lines from Germany were under constant air attack. Rations were sparse, often just black bread and ersatz coffee made from chicory. Many German troops wore uniforms taken from captured Soviet stocks, providing inadequate protection against the cold. Some soldiers wrapped their feet in newspaper for additional insulation. The contrast between German expectations and reality couldn't have been starker. They had convinced themselves that winter would limit Allied responses, that American forces would react slowly and cautiously. When Patton's Third Army struck on December 22nd, many German commanders initially refused to believe their frontline reports. An entire American army simply couldn't have repositioned that quickly. Colonel Hans von Luck, commanding a panzer regiment, recalled his reaction to the first reports. "We received word that American armor was attacking from the south in division strength. My first thought was that the report was wrong, perhaps exaggerated by troops under pressure. Then I saw them myself, columns of Sherman tanks advancing through the snow, fresh units that hadn't been there 2 days before. That's when I realized we had seriously underestimated the Americans. German tactical responses were hampered by command confusion. Hitler had placed rigid restrictions on how his generals could react to Allied moves. Armor couldn't be repositioned without personal approval from the Führer, and Hitler was often asleep or unavailable when quick decisions were needed. This centralized control paralyzed German responses at critical moments. Moreover, the offensive had already consumed German reserves at a faster rate than planned. Fuel shortages were crippling German operations by December 22nd. The plan had assumed rapid capture of American fuel stocks, but U.S. Army engineers had managed to destroy or evacuate on most fuel dumps before they could be seized. German tanks were literally running out of gas within sight of their objectives. The weather, which had initially favored the Germans by grounding Allied aircraft, was now working against them. The same snow and ice that had prevented American air attacks also made German supply columns vulnerable to attack and slowed German movements. German commanders watched helplessly as the window of opportunity closed. Attack through hell on December 22nd, with a massive snowstorm raging across Belgium and Luxembourg. Patton's 3 divisions struck. The assault came at 6 a.m. along a 20-mile front, catching German forces completely off guard. The 80th Infantry Division hit first, attacking from the vicinity of Luxembourg City toward the town of Ettelbruck. Despite having marched through the night in sub-zero temperatures, the Blue Ridge Division attacked with such ferocity that German defenders initially thought they were facing fresh troops. Company commanders led from the front, urging exhausted men forward through knee-deep snow. Lieutenant Paul Barney, leading a rifle platoon, described the opening assault. We moved out before dawn. The snow was so heavy you could barely see your hand in front of your face. We hit the German positions with everything we had. I remember thinking we must have looked like ghosts emerging from that blizzard. Frozen, exhausted ghosts who refused to stop. The 26th Infantry Division attacked through the center, pushing toward the town of Wiltz. German resistance was fierce. Wehrmacht units, recognizing that their entire offensive was threatened, fought with desperate determination. Machine gun nests positioned in stone farmhouses created interlocking fields of fire. German mortars dropped rounds with deadly accuracy into American formations. But the Americans kept coming. Squads that took casualties were reinforced and kept attacking. Platoons that were pinned down called for artillery support, and Third Army gunners responded with devastating barrages. The American doctrine of combined arms, infantry, armor, artillery, and air support working together, was being executed with precision, despite the challenging conditions. On the western flank, the 4th Armored Division launched the main thrust toward Bastogne. This was Patton's striking force, the armored fist that would smash through to the surrounded garrison. The division was organized into 3 combat commands, essentially 3 small combined arms teams that could operate independently. Combat Command A, led by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, took the lead. Abrams was a tanker's tanker, an aggressive commander who believed in leading from the front. His command consisted of 3 tank battalions, an armored infantry battalion, and supporting artillery. It was a compact, hard-hitting force designed for exactly this kind of mission. The roads toward Bastogne were narrow, winding through forests and small villages. This channelized terrain favored the defender, and German commanders had positioned their best remaining units along the likely American approach routes. The 5th Parachute Division, though battered by earlier fighting, still controlled key villages. Behind them, elements of the Panzer Division provided armored support. The combat was savage beyond description. American Shermans and German Panthers fought at point-blank range in village streets. Anti-tank guns hidden in buildings struck American armor from ambush positions. American tank destroyers with their powerful 76mm guns hunted German armor through forests and fields. Sergeant Lafayette Poole, the most successful American tank ace in Europe, led his Sherman platoon through the village of Chaumont. German anti-tank fire knocked out 2 of his tanks within minutes. Poole's Sherman took a hit that wounded his driver and damaged the transmission. Rather than withdraw, Poole continued the attack, using his tank's superior rate of fire to suppress German positions while his infantry cleared buildings. The weather remained brutally cold, but Patton had prayed for clear skies, and his prayer was about to be answered. On December 23rd, the clouds finally broke. For the first time in a week, the sun appeared over the snow-covered landscape of Belgium. Within minutes, Allied fighter bombers were airborne. P-47 Thunderbolts equipped with rockets and bombs descended on German positions like avenging angels. The 9th Air Force flew over 200 sorties that day alone, attacking German armor, supply convoys, and artillery positions. The psychological impact on German troops was devastating. They had expected winter weather to protect them from Allied air superiority, but now death reigned from clear skies. Patton's chaplain, Colonel James O'Neill, had written the prayer Patton requested. Almighty and most merciful Father, we humbly beseech thee of thy great goodness to restrain these immoderate rains with which we have had to contend. Grant us fair weather for battle. Patton had ordered the prayer printed and distributed to every soldier in Third Army. Now, with clear weather arriving exactly when needed, soldiers who had been skeptical found themselves wondering if perhaps divine intervention had played a role. The fighting around Bastogne intensified as Patton's forces drew closer. German commanders recognized that if the Americans broke through to the surrounded garrison, the entire southern shoulder of their offensive would collapse. They committed their operational reserves, including heavy tank battalions equipped with King Tiger tanks, the most powerful tanks in the world at that time. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams found himself facing these monsters on December 24th, Christmas Eve. His Shermans were outgunned and out-armored. A King Tiger's 80mm gun could destroy a Sherman at 2,000 yards, while a Sherman's 75mm gun could barely penetrate a King Tiger's frontal armor at any range. But Abrams was a tactical genius. He maneuvered his tanks to attack from flanks and rear, using terrain to close the range before firing. He coordinated with tank destroyers whose longer 76mm guns had a better chance of penetration. Most importantly, he never stopped attacking. When one avenue was blocked, he found another. When one tank was knocked out, another took its place. The battle consumed Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. American soldiers fought through both sacred days without pause, sustained by the knowledge that their surrounded comrades in Bastogne were counting on them. The 101st Airborne Division, holding Bastogne against overwhelming odds, was down to its last supplies. Medical supplies were exhausted. Ammunition was rationed. Wounded men lay in frozen cellars receiving minimal care. General Anthony McAuliffe, commanding the 101st in Bastogne, maintained morale through sheer force of personality. When German commanders sent a surrender ultimatum, McAuliffe's response became legendary. After reading the German message, he initially said, "Aw, nuts." His staff convinced him that this was the perfect official response. The single word, nuts, was sent back to the Germans, who were apparently confused by the American idiom. The response was later explained as meaning, "Go to hell." Inside Bastogne, soldiers heard the sound of Patton's artillery growing closer. They could see American fighter bombers attacking German positions in the surrounding area. Relief was coming, if they could hold just a little longer. Breaking the siege. The breakthrough came on December 26th, the day after Christmas. After 4 days of continuous combat, elements of the 4th Armored Division's 37th Tank Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Charles Bulge, finally punched through the last German defensive line south of Bastogne. Bulge had been fighting for 72 hours straight. His company had lost half its tanks. He was exhausted, running on coffee and adrenaline. But when scouts reported a gap in German defenses near the village of Bastogne, Bulge didn't hesitate. He formed his remaining tanks into a wedge formation and charged. "I didn't even think about it," Bulge later recalled. "We had orders to reach Bastogne, and by God, we were going to reach Bastogne. I told my driver, we're going through, no matter what." And we went. The dash to Bastogne became the stuff of legend. Bulge's tanks rolled through German positions at maximum speed, firing on the move. German infantry scattered, anti-tank guns fired and missed. For a brief, glorious moment, the momentum of the attack carried everything before it. At 4:45 p.m., Bulge's lead Sherman crashed through the final German roadblock and rolled into Bastogne's defensive perimeter. Paratroopers of the 101st Airborne, many of them wounded, emerged from foxholes and cellars to cheer the arrival of their rescuers. Men who had gone days without proper food or rest, who had fought against overwhelming odds, suddenly allowed themselves to believe they would survive. Lieutenant Webster, a paratrooper who had been defending Bastogne since December 20th, described the moment. "We heard the tanks before we saw them. American engines have a different sound than German ones. We learned to tell them apart. Then we saw them coming down the road, Shermans with white stars, and men started crying. Grown men, combat veterans, just broke down and cried with relief." The corridor Bulge opened was barely 500 yards wide, and German forces immediately tried to close it. For the next 48 hours, the narrow passage into Bastogne became one of the most contested pieces of ground in the entire battle. German artillery pounded the corridor constantly. Infantry and tank attacks tried to cut the road. but American forces held it open and gradually widened it, bringing in supplies, reinforcements, and evacuating the most seriously wounded. General McAuliffe met Patton when the Third Army commander entered Bastogne on December 30th. The two men shook hands amid the ruins of the town, surrounded by the evidence of desperate fighting: burned-out German tanks, destroyed buildings, hastily dug graves. "How are you, Tony?" Patton asked. "Gee, I'm mighty glad to see you, George," McAuliffe replied with characteristic understatement. Patton surveyed the destruction around him and nodded approvingly. "You did a hell of a job here. The 101st will get the credit it deserves. But we're not done yet. We're going to keep attacking until we've driven every German back where he came from." And Patton meant it. While other commanders might have been satisfied with relieving Bastogne, he saw the bigger picture. The German offensive had dangerously overextended their forces, creating opportunities for devastating counterstrokes. The Wehrmacht had committed its last reserves, and now those forces were trapped in a vulnerable salient, under attack from three sides. "Brad," he told General Bradley via telephone, "this time the Kraut has stuck his head in a meat grinder, and I've got my hand on the handle. We're going to keep grinding until there's nothing left." Grinding down the Wehrmacht, the systematic destruction of German forces in the Ardennes, took 6 more weeks of brutal winter warfare. This was no longer mobile tank warfare with rapid advances. This was attritional combat. Village by village, hill by hill, through some of the worst terrain and weather conditions imaginable. American and German soldiers fought in conditions that beggar description. Foxholes had to be dug, or more accurately, blasted, from frozen earth so hard it broke entrenching tools. Soldiers learned to use explosives to create fighting positions, detonating small charges to break up the frozen ground. Men huddled together in the darkness, sharing body heat, to avoid freezing to death. Sleeping was dangerous. Soldiers had to wake each other regularly to check for signs of frostbite. The snow, initially pristine white, gradually turned crimson and black with the blood and burnt powder of thousands of casualties. Medics worked in impossible conditions, trying to treat wounds in sub-zero temperatures. Plasma froze in its bottles. Morphine syrettes had to be kept next to medics' bodies to prevent freezing. Wounded men who might have survived in better conditions died from exposure before they could reach aid stations. Tank crews faced unique horrors. Inside their steel boxes, temperatures remained brutally cold, despite the engine heat. Touching bare metal with bare skin resulted in instant frostbite. Ammunition had to be handled carefully. Fingers could stick to frozen shells. Vision blocks frosted over constantly. Tank interiors became condensation chambers where every breath added to the ice buildup. Yet through all this, American forces continued attacking. Patton's philosophy of constant offensive action never wavered. He believed, correctly, that keeping pressure on the Germans prevented them from reorganizing, regrouping, or establishing new defensive positions. Every day without attacking was a day the enemy could use to strengthen their positions. The fighting took on a particularly savage character. Both sides knew this was the decisive battle of the Western Front. German soldiers fought with the desperation of men who knew defeat meant the destruction of their country. American soldiers fought with the righteous anger of men who had been surprised by what they considered a treacherous attack. Individual acts of heroism became commonplace. Sergeant Alvin York, the famous World War I Medal of Honor recipient, had said that a man who knows that he is living for the same thing that another man is living for, even if that thing be a hard and bitter struggle, can overcome anything. The men of Third Army proved this truth daily. Private First Class Richard Cowan stayed at his machine gun position near Bastogne for 4 hours after his company withdrew, covering their retreat. When his ammunition ran out, he defended his position with hand grenades and his rifle. When finally, forced to withdraw, he had killed over 24 German soldiers and delayed a German battalion. Staff Sergeant Louis Kurds, flying a P-51 Mustang, spotted a German transport aircraft heading toward German lines. He shot it down, then spotted what he thought was a German cargo plane. As he closed to attack, he recognized it as an American C-47 that had been captured by the Germans and was being used to fly Allied prisoners to German POW camps. Kurds carefully shot out the transport's engines, forcing it to crash land in Allied territory. He saved 17 American prisoners who were being transported to Germany. Lieutenant Colonel Crichton Abrams continued pushing his tanks forward day after day. His 4th Armored Division bore the brunt of the armored fighting around Bastogne. By mid-January, his Sherman tanks had destroyed over 100 German tanks and armored vehicles, though at severe cost to his own forces. When reporters asked how he kept his men fighting despite exhaustion and casualties, Abrams replied simply, "We follow General Patton's orders. We attack." By January 16, 1945, when American forces from north and south met at Houffalize, the Bulge was eliminated. The German offensive, which Hitler had hoped would break Allied unity and force a negotiated peace, had instead become the Wehrmacht's funeral on the Western Front. The statistics told a grim story. German casualties exceeded 100,000 men, killed, wounded, or captured. Over 700 tanks and 1,600 aircraft were destroyed or abandoned. Entire divisions ceased to exist as coherent fighting formations. Most critically, Germany had exhausted its last strategic reserves in a gamble that failed completely. The road to Berlin now lay open, defended only by shattered remnants of once proud units. American casualties were also severe, approximately 89,000 men, including 19,000 killed. But the United States could replace these losses. Germany could not. More importantly, American forces had proven they could fight and win under the worst possible conditions against the best the Wehrmacht could field. The verdict of history. Patton's role in this victory cannot be overstated. His ability to reposition 6 full divisions in 72 hours while maintaining their combat effectiveness remains one of the most extraordinary achievements in military history. Military colleges still study this operation as an example of what superior leadership and planning can accomplish. The Battle of the Bulge proved that George Patton was far more than just an aggressive tank commander. He was a strategic genius who understood that audacious action could transform desperate circumstances into decisive victories. He combined classical military principles with modern technology, aggressive leadership with careful planning, personal courage with strategic vision. The Germans, who had mocked American military proficiency in December, were no longer laughing in January. They had learned, at terrible cost, that American soldiers led by commanders like Patton could fight and win under the most extreme conditions imaginable. The myth of German military superiority, already fading after years of defeat, died completely in the frozen fields of the Ardennes. Winston Churchill, never quick to praise American achievements, called the Battle of the Bulge, undoubtedly, the greatest American battle of the war, and will, I believe, be regarded as an ever-famous American victory. Coming from Churchill, who had spent 4 years trying to demonstrate British military superiority over their American allies. This was praise indeed. President Franklin Roosevelt, in his State of the Union address in January 1945, specifically cited the Battle of the Bulge as evidence of American military prowess. The courage and tenacity of our forces and the skill of our commanders, Roosevelt declared, have turned what might have been disaster into triumph. For Patton himself, it was vindication of everything he had spent his life preparing for. The moment when his absolute confidence in his soldiers, combined with aggressive leadership and brilliant planning, overcame impossible odds. In his diary he wrote, "We can still lose this war. The Germans are a great fighting people, and they have the advantage of interior lines in the defense. But we have proven that with proper leadership, American soldiers are second to none." The battle revealed a fundamental truth about warfare that Patton understood better than perhaps any other commander of his generation. Superior leadership, aggressive action, and unshakable belief in one's troops can overcome any tactical disadvantage. Technology matters, numbers matter, logistics matter, but leadership matters most of all. The Germans had launched their offensive, believing that winter weather and American inexperience guaranteed success. They had calculated that American forces, dependent on their logistics and air superiority, would be paralyzed by winter conditions. They had assumed that American commanders would react cautiously and defensively. Instead, they discovered that Patton's Third Army could fight anywhere, anytime, against any enemy. They learned that American soldiers, properly led and motivated, were as tough and determined as any troops in the world. They found that American logistics, far from being a weakness in winter conditions, was actually a decisive strength that allowed rapid repositioning and sustained operations. The Ardennes became not Hitler's triumph, but his final devastating defeat, and the moment when American forces proved themselves in the ultimate test of winter warfare. The Wehrmacht would continue fighting for another 4 months, but its capacity for offensive operations ended in the Ardennes. After the Bulge, it was all retreat, all defense, all desperation. Patton continued commanding Third Army through the final campaigns in Germany. His forces crossed the Rhine River, liberated concentration camps, and drove deep into Czechoslovakia. But nothing in those final months matched the drama and significance of those desperate weeks in December and January, when he accomplished the impossible and saved the Allied campaign in Europe. Years later, when military historians assessed Patton's career, they invariably pointed to the Battle of the Bulge as his finest achievement. Not his spectacular dash across France, not his victories in North Africa or Sicily, but those crucial days when he took an impossible assignment, delivered on an unbelievable promise, and turned near disaster into decisive victory. The 2 words he spoke on December 19th, "play ball," set in motion events that changed the course of the war. They proved that individual leadership still mattered in modern warfare. They demonstrated that audacity and calculated risk could overcome superior enemy positions and terrible conditions. They showed that American soldiers, led by exceptional commanders, could match or exceed the combat effectiveness of any army in history. In the end, the Battle of the Bulge was more than just an American victory. It was proof that free men fighting for a just cause, led by commanders who believed in them, could overcome any challenge. It was the moment when America came of age as a military power, when American arms achieved their finest hour in the crucible of winter warfare. And it all began with 2 words: play ball.